The whole neighborhood laughed when he dragged his roof all the way down to the frozen ground. And now they're not laughing anymore. An old broke veteran in a thick red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket came to Duluth, Minnesota, hoping a quiet cabin and a loyal German shepherd would be enough to survive the winter and his own memories. But when the wind off Lake Superior turned into a screaming white beast, something strange happened. Every nearby cabin started freezing from the inside out, while his stayed 21 degrees warmer. Then the dog began growling at the north wall at the silence behind that sloped roof like it could hear the storm plotting. And what the veteran discovered wasn't just a clever design. It was a lesson powerful enough to humble an entire town. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments, because it's wild how far these winter stories travel. Winter rolled in from Lake Superior like a cold, ancient god dragging wind ice and sideways snow across the hills above Duluth. Frank Miller stood still for a long moment, outside his cabin boots, half buried in fresh powder breath, fogging through a graying beard that had once been regulation short, but now grew wild in defiance of mirrors. He was 72, tall but slightly hunched, the kind of man whose shoulders still remembered carrying weight long after the muscles had thinned. His face was sharply cut, cheekbones prominent jaw, squared by years of clenched teeth rather than comfort. The skin around his eyes was weathered and pale, permanently narrowed, as if bracing against glare or memory. Over everything, as always, he wore the same thick red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket, faded at the elbows, stiff with age, heavy enough to feel like armor. It had followed him through decades, through service, through loss, through winters when silence was louder than gunfire. Behind him, Rex sat in the snow without complaint. The German shepherd was nearly 10, muzzle dusted with gray coat, dark and dense, built solid rather than sleek. His amber eyes missed nothing. One ear stood fully upright, while the other bent slightly at the tip, a scar from a younger, rougher year. Rex did not bark at the wind or the swirling white chaos. Instead, he watched Frank tracking every movement with quiet certainty. He had learned long ago that when Frank stopped moving like this, something important was happening. The cabin itself was small, old, and unremarkable by Duluth standards. Rough logs, uneven, chinking a stone foundation, laid by hands, long gone. It sat on a slope facing north, completely exposed to the lake winds that came screaming downhill every winter. Frank had bought it cheap after retiring cheap, because no one wanted a place that bled heat the moment the wind picked up. The previous owner had frozen pipes 3 winters in a row. Frank had shrugged when the realtor warned him. He had faced worse enemies than cold, or so he thought. The laughter began in late autumn when Frank started working on the north side of the roof. Instead of repairing the vertical wall like any sensible person, he extended the roofline downward, longer, until the rafters nearly kissed the ground. Lumber stacked up. Nails rang out in the brittle air. Neighbors slowed their trucks when passing windows, rolling down just enough for voices to carry. One of them was Mark Jensen, a man in his early 40s with a round face, flushed skin, and a permanent smirk shaped by comfort rather than cruelty. Mark owned the nearest cabin down the slope, a neat conventional place with straight walls and short eaves. He had built it himself in 6 efficient weeks, proud of how quickly it had gone up. "You building a cabin or a ramp, Frank?" he called one afternoon, laughter following the words. Others joined in, men from the Ridge Road, bundled in modern jackets, shaking their heads at the wasted lumber. Frank never answered. He kept measuring, cutting, fitting. His hands were steady in a way that came not from strength, but from discipline. There had been an event decades earlier that shaped that discipline more than anything else. A winter ambush overseas, a misjudged angle wind funneling through a valley where it should not have been. He had survived because someone older had noticed the terrain instead of charging it. Frank rarely spoke of that night, but it lived in him, quiet and permanent. Since then, he had learned to respect invisible forces. Rex moved with him as he worked, padding back and forth, aware that something about this construction mattered. When the wind gusted, Rex instinctively pressed closer to the cabin wall as if testing it. Frank noticed. He always noticed. The jokes grew louder as the roof extension took shape. Someone compared it to a shed. Someone else said it looked like a mistake halfway through being corrected. At the small diner near the highway, Frank overheard his name paired with words like crazy and old soldier. He did not flinch. He had learned long ago that most people laughed at what they did not understand, especially when understanding required patience. By early December, the roof reached the ground. The north side of the cabin no longer met the wind with a flat face. Instead, it sloped downward like a long, quiet slide, earth banked carefully along its edge. Beneath it, Frank stacked firewood oak split and seasoned, protected from snow. The space smelled of dry bark and resin, comforting and solid. Rex immediately claimed it as his preferred resting place, lying there during storms where the air strangely refused to move. Inside the cabin, Frank noticed subtle changes even before real winter arrived. The stove pulled cleaner. The drafts softened. Nights were still cold but not aggressive. The cabin no longer felt like it was fighting something unseen. Frank found himself sleeping longer stretches, waking less often with that old sharp sense of alertness he had never fully shed after the war. Then January came, and with it the true voice of Lake Superior. Winds howled hard enough to make the trees creak like old joints. Snow drove sideways, rattling against conventional walls like thrown gravel. Frank stood at his window one evening and watched Mark Jensen struggle with his door, snow packing itself inside every time it opened. Mark's cabin smoked strangely, the chimney coughing back into the wind. Frank felt no satisfaction, only a quiet tightening in his chest, the same feeling he used to get before conditions turned bad. That night, as Rex lay beneath the sloped roof outside, utterly calm, Frank sat alone at his small table listening. The wind roared overhead, lifted cleanly by the long roof, passing over instead of through. The cabin held. The temperature dropped, but it did not collapse. Frank rested his palms on the wood, feeling the difference, understanding it not as theory, but as truth earned through patience. Outside, laughter had vanished, replaced by something else, unease perhaps, or curiosity. Frank did not know yet that the worst storm was still coming. He only knew that for the first time since moving to that hill, the cabin felt like it was on his side. Frank Miller never explained his choices to anyone, not because he lacked words, but because explanations had rarely saved lives when they truly mattered. The lesson had been carved into him decades earlier, in a frozen valley far from Minnesota, when a younger version of himself learned that strength meant nothing against forces that did not tire. Wind, panic, arrogance, those things killed faster than bullets. So now, as winter tightened its grip on Duluth, Frank worked in silence, shaping wood and earth with the calm patience of a man who no longer needed approval. Each morning he stepped outside in his red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket, the fabric stiff with cold, his boots crunching against snow packed hard as bone, and checked the long, sloping roof that now pressed low to the ground on the north side of his cabin. He would run a gloved hand along the planks, feeling for vibration, listening for the whistle of air. There was none. The wind came hard off Lake Superior, howling through the trees and ripping across open ground, but when it met Frank's cabin, it lifted, slid upward, and passed overhead like water diverted by stone. Rex sensed it too. The old German shepherd had grown deliberate with age, his movements slower but more intentional, as if every step cost something worth conserving. His coat was thick and dark snow collecting along his back, without melting, and his graying muzzle gave him a perpetually thoughtful expression. Instead of circling restlessly as he used to during storms, Rex began spending hours beneath the extended roof, lying on his side with his head on his paws, eyes half closed, breathing steady. Frank noticed how the dog chose that space without being led there, how his ears relaxed instead of flattening against his skull when the wind screamed past. Animals, Frank believed, understood truth without needing to name it. Inside the cabin, the change was undeniable. The stove burned the same wood at the same pace, but the air felt heavier, calmer. Heat lingered instead of fleeing. Frank found himself loosening his jacket indoors. For the first time since he'd moved in, sleeves rolled just enough to expose forearms lined with faded scars. At night, when the temperature dropped sharply, he sat at the small table by the window and watched snow swirl past the glass, without feeling that old, familiar sense of intrusion. The feeling that winter was pushing its way inside no matter what he did. The cabin no longer groaned and hissed in protest. It endured. The neighbors noticed, even if they did not admit it outright. Mark Jensen's truck drove past more slowly now, tires crunching over ice as the driver's eyes lingered on the strange silhouette of Frank's roof. Mark was not a cruel man, just confident in the kind of knowledge that came from doing things the way they had always been done. He had built his cabin square and upright, trusting thicker walls and a stronger fire. But confidence has a way of thinning when reality begins to contradict it. Smoke from Mark's chimney bent sharply in the wind, sometimes pushed downward, sometimes scattered, never rising cleanly. Frank saw him outside late one afternoon, chopping wood with unnecessary force, shoulders, tight movements, sharp frustration written plainly across his posture. Another neighbor appeared that week, someone Frank had only nodded to before. Her name was Sarah Collins, a woman in her late 50s, who lived alone in a narrow house farther up the ridge. She was tall and lean, with iron-gray hair cut short for practicality rather than style, and skin weathered by years of wind and sun. Her eyes were pale blue and observant, the kind that missed little and judged slowly. She walked with a straight back and careful steps, as if balance mattered deeply to her. When she stopped near Frank's property line, she did not laugh or comment. She simply stood there, hands in the pockets of her long coat, studying the slope of his roof like a problem she intended to solve. "It's quieter here," she said finally, her voice calm, almost curious. Frank nodded once. That was the extent of their conversation, but it was enough. As days passed, the forecast worsened. Radios crackled with warnings about an Arctic front descending hard and fast, wind speeds climbing, temperatures plunging. Frank listened without reaction. He had already prepared. Beneath the extended roof, the stacked firewood stayed dry and accessible. He did not need to open the cabin door, as often did not spill precious heat into the air each time he fed the stove. The earth banked against the lower edge of the roof had frozen solid, adding weight, adding stability. Rex followed Frank through his routines, pausing when Frank paused, watching, when Frank listened, his loyalty quiet and unquestioning. The first real test came not at night, but in the late afternoon, when the wind shifted suddenly and struck with renewed violence. Snow drove sideways, stinging exposed skin visibility, dropping to almost nothing. Frank stepped outside, briefly leaning into the gusts, feeling how the air behaved around the cabin. The wind rushed up the slope of the roof, accelerated and vanished above him. It did not press against the walls. It did not claw its way through cracks. Frank stood there longer than necessary, letting the cold bite his beard, remembering another wind long ago that had taught him the cost of misjudgment. This time he felt no fear. Across the slope, Mark Jensen's cabin was already struggling. Frank could see movement through the storm, Mark's silhouette darting back and forth, the door opening and closing far too often. Each time it opened, a plume of warmth escaped, instantly devoured by the wind. Frank felt a familiar tightening in his chest, not satisfaction, not pride, but concern. Survival was not a competition. It was a shared condition, and Winter did not care who deserved to lose. That evening, as darkness fell early and the storm gathered strength, Frank settled into his chair with a cup of coffee, Rex lying nearby under the table. The cabin was cold, yes, but it was stable. The air did not rush. The walls did not tremble. Frank closed his eyes briefly, listening to the storm slide over the roof like water over stone, and allowed himself a rare moment of certainty. He was not fighting winter anymore. He was letting it pass. The storm arrived without ceremony, as if Lake Superior itself had decided to exhale all at once, sending wind and snow downhill in a sustained roar that erased edges and swallowed sound. By dusk, the world beyond Frank Miller's cabin had narrowed to a tunnel of white, the kind of weather that made distance meaningless and direction uncertain. The wind climbed steadily past 30 miles per hour, pushing snow sideways so hard it struck like grit against exposed skin, and the temperature fell with an indifference that felt almost deliberate. Frank noticed it first, not by sight or sound, but by memory, the way his body tightened in recognition, the way his hands moved with practiced economy as he secured the last latch and stepped inside. Rex followed him in shaking snow from his thick coat, then settling immediately beneath the table, curling into a compact shape that conserved warmth. At nearly 10 years old, Rex no longer wasted energy. His breathing was slow and even, chest rising and falling, with the calm of a creature that trusted its environment. His graying muzzle rested against his foreleg, eyes half-lidded, but alert, ears twitching only when something truly changed. Frank took a moment to study him, noting with quiet satisfaction that the dog showed no signs of distress. In past winters, Rex had paced during storms, nails clicking against the floor, unsettled by drafts and sudden noises. Tonight, there was none of that. Frank checked the thermometer mounted beside the window. The glass fogged slightly from the warmth inside. 47 degrees. Cold but steady. He glanced outside where the second thermometer hung just beyond the glass, buffeted by wind and snow, the red line hovering far lower. The difference over 20 degrees registered in his mind without surprise. He had expected it. What struck him instead was the absence of urgency. He did not feel hunted by the night. The stove crackled softly, burning clean, its heat lingering instead of being pulled upward and away. Frank poured himself a cup of coffee, hands steady movements, unhurried, and sat down as the storm intensified. Across the slope, the night was unfolding very differently. Mark Jensen's cabin fought the wind like a man pushing against a tide. Mark himself was broad-shouldered and strong, his beard thick and dark, usually trimmed neatly, but now wild with frost. He had grown up believing that effort solved most problems, that if something resisted, you pushed harder. That belief had served him well in work and life until winter demanded something different. Inside his cabin, the fire burned hot, devouring wood at an alarming rate, but the heat fled almost as quickly as it was made. Smoke curled back down the chimney, with each stronger gust stinging his eyes, forcing him to open the door repeatedly just to clear the air. Every opening dumped precious warmth into the storm, and snow followed it inside, melting and refreezing along the threshold. Mark's thermometer dipped steadily, the needle sliding past 30, then 28, while his arms ached from chopping and hauling. Farther up the ridge, Sarah Collins watched the storm from her narrow front window, wrapped in a wool blanket, her sharp features drawn tight with concentration. Sarah had lived alone for over a decade since her husband's death, in a construction accident. that left her wary of things failing under pressure. She trusted observation more than assumption, patience more than force. Her house, smaller than Mark's, and older, creaked and sighed as the wind battered it, but she managed it carefully, feeding her stove sparingly, sealing drafts with practiced hands. Still, she felt the cold seeping in the walls, radiating it back at her. She thought of Frank's cabin, the strange sloping roof, and found herself wondering, not scoffing, whether she had dismissed something worth understanding. The storm peaked near midnight. Snow piled against doors and windows, whined screaming like something alive probing for weakness. In Mark's cabin, water froze in its bucket despite being kept near the stove. His hands stiffened, fingers clumsy, as he fumbled with kindling breath, clouding thickly in the air. Each task took longer, required more effort, and his frustration mounted into a dull panic he could not quite name. He thought fleetingly of Frank, of the quiet confidence with which the old veteran had worked, and the thought unsettled him more than the cold. Inside Frank's cabin, the night passed differently. The temperature dipped slightly, then stabilized again. The walls did not hiss or tremble. The air remained heavy and still, the kind of stillness that allowed a man to think clearly. Frank sipped his coffee, now lukewarm, and let his thoughts drift backward, not to the storm outside, but to another night long ago when cold and wind had mattered just as much. He remembered younger men panicking, wasting energy, fighting conditions that did not care. He remembered the one who survived by reading the land instead of challenging it. Frank had carried that lesson with him ever since, through years that demanded strength and years that demanded endurance. Tonight, it felt quietly validated. Rex shifted once, lifting his head to look at Frank, then settled again, satisfied. Frank rested his hand briefly on the dog's broad back, feeling the warmth there, the steady life. Sleep came in short, comfortable stretches. He woke once to add a log, once to check the thermometer again. 46 degrees, outside far below. Enough, Frank thought. Enough to function. Enough to rest. By early morning, the storm began to loosen its grip. The wind eased from a scream to a growl, snow falling more gently, now settling instead of attacking. Frank rose with the gray light filtering through the window and stepped outside, Rex at his side. The world was transformed, buried under a thick, uneven blanket of white. He walked the length of the sloped roof, brushing snow away, checking supports. Everything held. The earth-packed base was solid, the wood dry beneath. The wind, even now, slid harmlessly overhead. Down the slope, Mark Jensen emerged from his cabin, looking older than he had the day before. Shoulders slumped, movements stiff. His beard was rimmed with ice, his eyes bloodshot from smoke and lack of sleep. He surveyed the damage silently, snowdrifts inside his doorway, an empty woodpile reduced far too quickly. When he looked up and saw Frank standing calmly outside his own cabin, steam rising gently from the chimney, something shifted in his expression. It was not envy nor resentment, but the dawning recognition that effort alone had not been enough. Frank did not wave. He did not call out. He simply stood there, Rex beside him, both of them unbothered by the cold, bearing quiet witness to two very different measurements of the same night. Morning arrived pale and brittle, the kind of light that follows a night when winter has tested everything and left its marks behind. The wind had eased, but the cold remained settled deep into the land, like a judgment that would not be hurried away. Frank Miller stepped out of his cabin just after sunrise, boots crunching into snow hardened by the storm, his breath slow and steady. The red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket hung from his shoulders like a familiar weight, the collar turned up against the cold. Rex emerged beside him, stretching his long legs, shaking frost from his thick coat, before sitting calmly near the sloped roof, as if claiming it as territory earned rather than given. The first visitor arrived quietly. It was Mark Jensen walking uphill with careful steps, shoulders still stiff from a night without real rest. In the daylight, he looked older than his 40-some years, the angles of his face sharper beard untrimmed and rimmed with melted frost. His eyes carried the dull redness of smoke exposure and fatigue, but also something new, hesitation. Mark had always been confident in groups, quick with jokes, louder when surrounded by agreement. Alone, he was different. He stopped several feet from Frank's cabin, hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets, gaze fixed on the roof that sloped all the way down to the earth. He said nothing at first, and Frank did not fill the silence. Soon others followed. Two men from farther along the ridge arrived together, bundled in modern, insulated coats that looked expensive but ineffective after the night they'd endured. One was Paul Henriksen, short and thick-set with a permanently furrowed brow and a voice that usually carried more certainty than patience. The other, younger and quieter, was Eli Turner, barely 30, lean, with sharp features and eyes that studied everything carefully, as if already aware that certainty was a fragile thing. They approached slowly, boots sinking into snowheads, tilting as they took in the scene. Dry firewood stacked neatly beneath the roof. No snow drifted against Frank's north wall. No ice choking the doorway. Sarah Collins arrived last, walking alone from the upper ridge. She moved with measured steps, tall and spare gray hair catching the light, pale skin flushed by the cold. Her eyes, observant and cool, traveled from the roofline to the ground, and then to Rex, who acknowledged her with a brief glance before returning his attention to Frank. Sarah gave a small nod, not quite approval, not quite surprise, something closer to confirmation. They stood there together, an uneven semicircle of people who had once laughed, now quiet. The laughter had not vanished out of embarrassment alone. It had been replaced by the weight of evidence. Mark finally cleared his throat. "You didn't burn more wood," he said, not a question, but a statement he needed to hear aloud. Frank shook his head once. "Same stove," he replied. "Same fuel." His voice was low even without triumph. He did not invite them inside. He did not need to. The proof was already visible. Paul Henriksen stepped closer, crouching near the edge where the roof met the ground. He brushed snow aside with a gloved hand, frowning as he examined the packed earth and the sheltered space beneath. "So the wind just goes over it?" he asked, sounding almost disappointed that the answer might be that simple. Frank met his eyes briefly. "It doesn't get a chance to push," he said. "Nothing pushing means nothing pulling heat out." He did not mention pressure or physics or theory. He spoke as a man who had learned the cost of misunderstanding invisible forces. Eli Turner knelt beside Paul, measuring the slope with his eye fingers, tracing the angle in the air. His expression was intent, curious rather than defensive. "You planned this," he said quietly. Frank nodded. "I paid attention," he replied. That was as far as he took it. Mark Jensen had drifted closer now, standing near Rex, who remained calm, tail resting against the snow. Mark noticed the dog first, how relaxed he looked, how different from the restless pacing he'd seen through Frank's window in past winters. "He slept through it," Mark said, half to himself. Frank followed his gaze. "So did I." The words landed heavier than Frank intended. Mark swallowed, eyes dropping briefly to the ground. The night had taken something from him, confidence perhaps, or the belief that effort alone guaranteed outcome. No one laughed. No one argued. Instead, they began asking questions, not loudly, not all at once, but carefully, as if afraid that certainty might shatter if handled roughly. How long was the extension? How far from the wall? How he kept the wood dry? Frank answered only what was asked, never more. When he did not know, he said so. When something had come from experience rather than calculation, he admitted that too. Sarah listened closely, arms crossed, loosely absorbing not just the answers, but the way Frank spoke without defensiveness, without the need to convince. At one point, Paul made a half-joking comment about wasted lumber, the old phrase slipping out of habit. It died quickly unfinished as he caught himself and glanced at the roof again. No one smiled. Even he seemed embarrassed by the echo of his own words. The conversation shifted from ridicule to replication. Eli asked whether an existing cabin could be modified. Frank considered this eyes narrowing slightly as he thought it through. Depends on the structure, he said, and how much wind you're fighting. That answer opened another line of questions, more technical, now more serious. Measurements were discussed. Steps imagined. Mark listened without speaking, his hands flexing inside his pockets, as if already picturing his own north wall differently. Rex rose at one point and walked the length of the roof's edge nose low, checking scents, then returned to sit near Frank's boot. The gesture was small but telling. The dog moved like a creature that trusted the environment fully. Sarah noticed. Her gaze lingered on Rex before returning to Frank. "Animals know," she said quietly. Frank nodded. Eventually, the cold drove them back. One by one, they thanked Frank not effusively, not with apologies, but with a new kind of respect that did not require either. Mark lingered last. "I might ask for help," he said finally, voice rough. Frank met his eyes and gave a single nod. Not agreement, not refusal, just acknowledgement. As the group dispersed, the hill returned to its quiet. Frank stood for a moment longer watching them go, then turned back toward his cabin. Rex followed unhurried. The laughter was gone, replaced by something sturdier. Curiosity, humility. The first steps of learning. Frank did not smile. He simply closed the door behind him, satisfied that the truth once seen no longer needed defending. Spring did not arrive in Duluth all at once. It came cautiously in thin slices of light that lingered a little longer each evening, in patches of snow that retreated without ceremony, and in the sound of meltwater running quietly beneath ice. Frank Miller noticed these changes the way he noticed most things, now not with excitement, but with awareness. The winter had passed its verdict, and the cabin had held. That alone was enough. The sloped roof remained darkened by months of snow and wind pressed low to the earth, as if bowing to forces it had already learned to redirect. Beneath it, Rex still lay each afternoon, though the old German shepherd moved more slowly now. His once powerful stride had softened into a careful walk, his joints stiff on cold mornings. His coat, still thick, showed more gray along the spine, and his muzzle had turned almost entirely silver. At nearly 11 years old, Rex no longer chased shadows or barked at passing trucks. He watched instead. He listened. He rested his head on Frank's boot when the man stood still too long, as if reminding him that time, like winter, always moved forward. Frank felt it too. His body recovered more slowly from long days of work, and his hands sometimes ached in ways that had nothing to do with the cold. Yet there was a lightness in him he had not expected. The winter had not demanded constant vigilance. It had not forced him into crisis mode night after night. He had slept. He had functioned. He had lived instead of merely enduring. That difference stayed with him long after the snow began to recede. The hill above Duluth changed as well. One by one, cabins began to show signs of quiet revision. Mark Jensen was the first. He arrived one morning without announcement, his beard neatly trimmed, now face less guarded. He had always been a big man, broad through the shoulders, but something in his posture had shifted. He no longer stood as if bracing for argument. "I measured," he said simply, holding up a folded tape measure. Frank nodded. They worked side by side that day without much conversation, Rex watching from the shade. Mark asked questions when he needed to, listened when Frank answered, and stopped when Frank stopped. The laughter that had once defined him never returned. In its place was something steadier. Others followed in smaller ways. Eli Turner modified his north wall testing angles with a cautious optimism that suited his sharp, thoughtful features. Sarah Collins did not build immediately. She observed. She walked the ridge with her hands in her pockets, tall and composed, pale skin warmed slightly by the strengthening sun, gray hair catching the breeze. When she finally spoke to Frank again, it was not about wood or roofs. "You didn't try to win," she said. "You adapted." Frank considered that. "I got tired of fighting things that don't get tired," he replied. Sarah smiled once briefly, as if that answered more than he knew. By late spring, the cabin no longer stood out as strangely as it once had. It still looked different, but difference had lost its power to provoke. What remained was function visible and undeniable. Frank spent more time outside now, sitting on the low step near the door, Rex at his side, watching clouds drift without urgency. Sometimes children from the lower road would stop and stare at the roof, whispering questions. Frank never chased them away. Rex lifted his head, assessed them, then returned to his rest. One afternoon, a man Frank did not recognize climbed the hill. His name was Daniel Brooks, introduced with a firm handshake and a measured voice. Daniel was in his early 50s, tall and narrow face lined not by age but by long habit. His hair was dark, streaked with gray at the temples, and his eyes carried the careful focus of someone who had learned to survive by observing patterns. He worked in building inspection for the county, he explained, and had heard about the cabin that stayed warmer during the storm. His interest was professional, but not skeptical. He asked about wind direction, ground contact, snow load. Frank answered, plainly unconcerned with impressing him. Daniel took notes, nodding slowly. Sometimes he said almost to himself, the old solutions last because they were right. As summer edged closer, Rex's pace slowed further. He slept longer, rose more carefully, but always returned to the sloped roof when evening came. It had become his place. Frank noticed the way the dog breathed there, the ease of it, and understood that animals chose comfort without apology. One evening, as the sky burned orange over the lake, Rex struggled briefly to stand, then settled again with a soft sigh. Frank sat beside him, resting a hand on the familiar curve of his back. There was no fear in the moment, only recognition. Nothing needed to be fixed. Nothing needed to be fought. Frank thought about the man he had been when he first arrived on the hill, convinced that survival meant strength, endurance, constant readiness. Winter had taught him otherwise. Survival, he realized, sometimes meant shaping your life so that hardship could pass over you instead of through you. It meant knowing when to stand firm and when to lower yourself just enough to let the storm slide by. Rex lifted his head and looked at him, then eyes clouded but trusting. Frank smiled, a small, private thing. When the first warm rain of the season fell, it ran cleanly off the sloped roof, soaking into the ground without pooling or resistance. Frank watched it from the doorway, feeling neither triumph nor regret. The cabin stood. The lesson remained. He did not know how many winters he had left, but he knew this much: he would not spend them fighting forces that did not care. He would live as he had built, quietly, thoughtfully, allowing what could not be stopped to move on. Rex shifted closer, leaning his weight gently against Frank's leg, and together they watched the world soften. At the end of this story, many people call what happened a clever design or a smart trick of survival. But sometimes what we witness feels closer to a quiet miracle. Not the kind that breaks the laws of nature, but the kind that reveals them at exactly the right moment. God does not always stop the storm. Often he teaches us how to stand so the storm cannot destroy us. Frank did not defeat winter with force. He listened. He observed. He adjusted. And in doing so, he discovered a truth that echoes far beyond one cabin on a frozen hill. In daily life, we suffer not because challenges are too strong, but because we keep standing rigid where we were meant to bend. Illness, loss, disappointment, loneliness, these winds come to every life. And faith does not mean pretending they are not there. Faith means trusting that God gives us wisdom to reshape ourselves so those winds pass over us instead of through us. In your own life, maybe there is something you have been fighting for years, pushing harder, praying louder, exhausting yourself, when the real answer is a quieter one. A change in posture, a change in perspective, a willingness to listen for God's guidance instead of demanding immediate relief. Miracles often look like patience, clarity, and the courage to adapt. If this story touched you, take a moment to share it with someone who may be facing a hard winter of their own. Leave a comment below and tell us what storm you're learning to live through, or what lesson God has quietly taught you along the way. And if stories like this bring you comfort and hope, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing reminders that faith, wisdom, and resilience still matter. May God bless every person watching, protect your homes, steady your hearts, and guide you through whatever season you are in. May His peace cover you like a shelter in the storm, and may you never forget that even in the coldest nights, you are not alone.